but true witness, and that becomes a key category. We then pivoted after that and began to talk about asceticism or ascetic practice, as well as communal ethics. If you remember, the word asceticism comes from the Greek word askesis, which means to train or discipline. And it originally is used primarily in athletic contexts, right? So an athlete trains or disciplines their body in preparation for engaging in a contest of some sort. We talked about how asceticism then was a pathway not only for training and disciplining and making ourselves in some sense able to more properly imitate Christ. This was sort of the argument, but also several ascetic practices, particularly practices around fasting and things of that nature, staying up all night to pray, memorizing scripture. These were also supposed to be sort of equipping the self in preparation for the possibility that you might actually be persecuted or martyred. So there's a kind of continuity or a continuum in which asceticism needs to be understood. We then pivoted and we said, of course, early Christianity is not, most people do not think about, they don't think on the level of individualism in the way that we might use that term. People are enmeshed in communities. They are who they are because of the group that they are a part of. And so communal ethics then is a really important element that we find the early Christians wrestling with as they try to answer this question, what does it mean to be a Christian? And so I utilized the language of being set apart, right? The discourse we might call of holiness, which means to be set apart. And I gave you some kind of indications of that around outlawing certain practices and pursuing other practices, many of which would have been considered countercultural. One of the ones that we kind of highlighted in particular was this deep aversion to bloodletting of any kind, whether it comes in the form of hunting, of soldiering, or even of participating in a capital case in which someone could be executed. There is just this very deep allergy to bloodletting that we want to kind of see as a part of the way that early Christians are thinking about themselves. And if we think about, of course, Rome and the context, right, this is very definitely countercultural because it's a very violent period to live. We then pivoted. We got through a couple of other pieces before we ended. One was we noted the different organizing models that were used to think about how are we going to organize ourselves? How is authority going to function? How is power going to flow? I noted that basically very early on there are two tensional approaches, and I think it would be fair to say that these are probably present. Both of these models are probably present in one way or another in almost every community, right? So the first is the free teacher prophetism, and this is sort of the idea that comes out of the Greco-Roman as well as the Jewish model, that those who are charismatically gifted are the ones who lead, and that this approach also doesn't put as much emphasis on a structure or a kind of bureaucratic apparatus of authority, but rather it tends to have a little bit more of an egalitarian, maybe proto-democratic kind of feel to it, we might say. But you get a sense there, right, that those who are particularly charismatically gifted are the ones who are going to be leading. The other model is the episcopal structure model. Episkopos, that word, is a Greek word that simply means overseer. And Paul uses this language in some of his epistles. We also see Paul talking about like the organization, say, of the Corinthian community, which feels more like a free teacher prophetism way of organizing. But the Episcopal model then is a structure, right, that in which the bishop becomes a central emblem of unity. And you have to be in good standing with the bishop, in a sense, to be in good standing with the whole community. And so you can already sort of see this is sort of this would be sort of the early forming of what eventually becomes the larger structure, where we get bishops and archbishops and popes and things of that nature. In both cases, I think it would be fair to say, as I mentioned here at the end, these are probably mingled together depending on the community that you're looking at or the individual that you're looking at, because I think it'd be fair to say that most of the bishops that we know about at least the ones that stand out to us, are people who are also charismatically gifted. And certainly even those communities that are charismatically gifted and egalitarian are going to have some sort of mode of organization. So that's what I mean when I said they're probably mingled together. I think it's fair to say, though, that as the early church progresses, particularly as we move into the 3rd century, 4th century, beyond, the Episcopal model obviously becomes the standard model until we get, up into like Middle Ages even. But there's always a tension here. It doesn't, the free teacher prophetism thing doesn't go away, and then all of a sudden it's just rediscovered in the Reformation. It remains, but it typically remains on the edges. Then the last thing I talked about was what I call fulfillment theology. And this is the idea that the Christian gospel, and therefore the Christian movement in a sense, is really the sum, right? The summation of all human longing. So what has happened in Jesus is what all people have wanted deep down in their bones. And this is an argument that's sort of made in an apologetic kind of sense, a sort of sense of defense or of making an argument for why Christianity matters. We noted in particular that this is aimed in 2 different directions, and particularly in the early period that we're talking about. One is towards the Jewish tradition, and therefore is probably polemically kind of being aimed at the Pharisaical or eventually the rabbinical movement. And here the argument is that, well, Christianity is really the true Israel. That leads to a really serious problem over time. And I mentioned that before last week, the problem of supersessionism, which is the belief that the church replaces Israel rather than that the church is engrafted into the people Israel, or the Gentiles are engrafted in that way. But we note that that's there. This is a development then that's there for how Christians are thinking about themselves. The other direction then is the one that we also talked about, and you're going to see that this is going to come back up a few times as we move forward, and that is this notion of Christianity or the Christian gospel, especially as it becomes elaborated over time, is understood really as the true philosophy. Right. So what someone like Justin Martyr, and I've actually got a text in here for you that you'll see later, what they're going to say is like, the philosophers talked about, truth, or they talked about the logos, or they talked about this, and this, but they only could get part of it. But what they got was right, but they could only get part of it. And then he's going to pivot, and he's going to say, but we behold the full truth. And so the true summation, right, the true place where the philosophical longings of the Greco-Roman tradition can find their final end, especially if it's carefully managed, is going to be in Christianity or the Christian gospel. So on the one hand, New Israel, on the other hand, true philosophy. Certainly the New Israel one is especially problematic as the history unfolds. Okay. So now what I want to do is I'm going to pivot then. We've been talking about the question of identity, and now we're going to pivot towards the God question. And I want to introduce you to really the first major attempt sort of outside of the New Testament context to wrestle with, well, who exactly is Jesus, and in relationship then to Israel, or to the God of Israel in a sense. And what we need to note as we think about this, number one, is that the church, as we move into the 2nd and up into the 3rd century, it's growing significantly, and in particular, the makeup, the demographic makeup of the church is becoming more and more Gentile. All right, which means, of course, though, we want to keep in mind with strong connections continuing to be there for the Jewish component of the faith. But what that means then is that we have to find a way to articulate the message in a way that becomes intelligible for folks who may or may not have a Jewish background, right? And so I do have here for you, just to give you a sense that we're talking about a very small sliver of the population of the empire during this time, so 4 to 7%. Those are sort of the numbers that have come through in the scholarship, and those are also, of course, estimates. So we want to offer a more robust articulation of the Christian faith, one that can make sense of the witness of Scripture, that can make sense of the connection to the God of Israel, but also can make sense of the Greco-Roman context in which we live. And the first of those is what comes to be called the Logos Christology. So what I want to do now is we're going to talk about Justin Martyr on the one hand as a key figure of articulating this, and on the other hand, the Logos Christology. So first of all, Justin Martyr. So Justin, by the way, his last name is not Martyr. He just comes to be called Justin Martyr because he's martyred somewhere around 165 or so, under the reign of Marcus Aurelius. He would be considered an early Christian philosopher or early Christian apologist. What we know about his life, as I say here on the screen, only really comes from his own writings. And we're hard pressed to be able to verify everything, but I'll kind of give you a sense from what we get of his writings. He is not originally from the western part of the empire, which is where his story is going to kind of conclude. He's going to wind up traveling to Rome. He actually is raised in Syria, Palestine. And most folks think he's of Roman descent. The reason for that is primarily because of the education he appears to have had. So basically, he shows that he's had some form of a classical education with significant engagement in philosophical traditions. And typically, that's only going to be open to people of significant means and more than likely of some kind of Roman descent. As I say here, he talks about in one of his writings how intrigued he was by philosophy. And remember, philosophy, that word breaks down to love of wisdom. Right? So philo is one of the words, the Greek words for love, and sophos, right, the word for wisdom, or Sophia. And so people were interested in philosophy not just as a intellectual exercise, but philosophy was understood to be a holistic sensibility. And what you did was you dedicated your life to philosophical study, specifically so that if you finally did sort of link into what you thought the truth of the universe was, you would be able then to order your life so that you lived in a sense with the grain of the universe, right? So that's the idea. So philosophy here in the ancient world is more like a life philosophy, as opposed to what we might think about, which is kind of like arguing about just about ideas that maybe are or maybe are not connected to real life. For these folks, they were connected to life. So he becomes interested in this question. It probably is just, a natural thing to be curious about some of this stuff and wanting to know, how do I live a good life, etc. He gets drawn to the Stoic traditions as well as the writings of Plato. He tells us that an older man, kind of after he's kind of made his way through the Stoic and Platonic writings, an older man winds up tutoring him using the Torah. So using the Old Testament, and it's through the reading of the Torah that he comes to be converted. There is some indication in his writings that he may also have witnessed a martyrdom and that he was struck by the courage of these Christians. So we don't know for sure, but that may also have played a role. All right. So eventually he makes his way to Rome, and I think he kind of functions as a free teacher. And a free teacher would have been someone, right, who, was trained philosophically and wanted to teach or offer lectures or discussions, whether through lecture method or through Socratic method, but that they were not connected to an academy, right? They had to raise funds to support themselves in some other way. They might beg, they might work with their hands, they might find a wealthy patron, etc. So he goes to Rome, he functions as a free teacher. He winds up becoming a very significant figure in the Roman church, or the various communities that comprise the Roman church. He winds up also teaching other figures that we've actually talked about. I don't know if you remember in our discussion of Christianity on the Silk Road, where I talked about the figure Tatian. He was one of the early Assyrian figures. Tatian had traveled to Rome, studies under Justin Martyr, and then goes back to Mesopotamia. Irenaeus is another figure. You probably have not heard of Irenaeus, but I'm going to come back and talk about him later. But he also received some level of teaching, at least according to tradition, from Justin Martyr. In the church historian Eusebius, we have a list several sources from Justin Martyr, but only 3 of those have survived. And here's another one of those examples of what I said, that the 2nd century, we have lost so much material from that period, like somewhere around 85% of the works that the titles of which we know, are lost to us. But Justin Martyr, we have 3 works: the First and Second Apology. These are aimed primarily at the Greco-Roman context, and then the Dialogue with Trypho the Jew. This is aimed at the Jewish context. So if those are works that you might be interested in, I would certainly recommend checking them out, particularly the Second Apology. Looks like I might have had a question. Sarah is asking if everyone can see the slides. Everybody okay?
We have at least one person who can't right now, but as long as it's not everyone, then we know it's not a problem on your end.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Sarah. All right, so I've introduced you then to Justin. Justin becomes then the most important figure to articulate what I call the Logos Christology. So first of all, let me just get a definition out of the way. Christology, because I'm going to talk about logos here in a minute, and you'll have more than enough to work with. Christology is simply the sort of theological word, academic word, whatever you want to say, that names our thinking, speaking, or talking about Jesus, right? So this is Jesus talk, and in particular, how does Jesus relate to God, and how does Jesus relate to us? What does Jesus come to do? So Christology becomes kind of a big tent word there. So it's the attempt then to answer the Jesus question that we started with. And the first attempt of that is to highlight this term logos, all right? And as I say here, yeah, this is an attempt to answer the question, who is Jesus and what's his relationship to God? So what does the term logos mean, all right? So it basically has 2 backgrounds that Justin clearly is drawing on, and that we want to highlight. The first is it comes out of the Greek philosophical tradition, that there is a long tradition there going back to the Stoics who precede Plato, who talk about this thing called the Logos, all right? So in very quick, thumbnail sketch, for Greeks, there's a real fascination with the idea of cosmos on the one hand and chaos on the other. And their sensibility is that cosmos has to do with ordering, and of course chaos has to do with disorder. And the Greeks kind of look around at the world and they note there's so much diversity in the world, and yet somehow the world is not utterly chaotic. It's held together somehow. It has a kind of order. And the Stoics postulate that the thing that gives order to everything, they call it the Logos. All right, so that's where their conception comes from. As I mentioned here, I just said the rational principle, which holds all things together and also moves them towards their proper end, right? So we use this word logos as a derivative for all kinds of words for us, for logic, logical, right? So even the Christology word up there, that includes a kind of a component of logos. The word also means speech and rationality, rational thinking, etc. So you can kind of see all that. It does awful lot of work in the Greek language, and also gives to us a lot of our concepts. So the Stoics view it this way. In the Jewish context, and also in the context to a certain extent of the New Testament, but I'm thinking here in particular the Septuagint, right, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The word logos, right, literally means word, and this oftentimes is used to articulate what comes to be described as the word of the Lord or the word of God, right? And that shows up everywhere, right? So God calls the world, speaks the world into existence, right? Out of the void, out of the nothingness, out of the chaos, order comes, right? We hear about at the beginning of the Gospel of John, the Word was with God and the Word became flesh, right? That same, if you go into the Greek there, that word is logos. And so it has a kind of similar sensibility in the Jewish context, right? Word then also refers to the rational reality or structure of the universe. And it also, of course, talks about purpose, right? So whenever God speaks to us, God doesn't just convey information, but gives purpose and pushes us to move forward. Now, as a small aside, Justin is drawing on these concepts to articulate something, but he's not the first person to do this. We already have Philo 100 years prior, and Philo was Jewish, using the Greek conception of logos to talk about God's word. So we've already got a sense of kind of dialogue between the Hebrew tradition and the Greek tradition going on even 100 years earlier. So what is it exactly that that the logos does or is, or how does Justin kind of develop this? And there's two places where I just want to highlight. One is I want to highlight, how does Justin think about the logos's relationship to God? So and we can put this in a different light for us. What is Jesus's relationship to God? And then on the other hand, what is the work that the logos comes to do, right? So who and what to do. So what we might sometimes call the person and the work. That's how it winds up getting developed later on in the history of Christian doctrine. So first of all, the logos' relationship to God. So logos becomes a way of talking about the second person, Jesus, and the way that Justin wants to articulate this is to say that God is God, and God has a mind, and that mind is the logos in a sense, right? So the logos is understood because it's the thing that gives purpose, rationality, holds all things together. In a sense, this is that part of God that we might call the faculty of reason. God has had this logos from all of eternity, right? Because God is eternal, it stands to reason that God's mind is going to be eternal. At the moment of creation, right? So when creation comes into existence, God wants to have an entity that is God and yet is also not God, to be able to mediate between God and that which is not God, which is creation. And that's going to become the logos. So at the moment of creation, the logos comes also out from God. So creation is one act, which occurs by God's will. The other act is the logos coming out from God, also a function of the will, according to Justin, which later on is going to have to be amended and winds up being amended by the tradition. So the logos comes to function as a kind of mediator between God and creation. And that means that and so this picks up on all this kind of New Testament language. How do you get to God? How do you get to the Father? You only get to the Father through Jesus, right? How do you engage God? You only engage God through the logos, through Jesus. So a mediating function is important. But also important for Justin, at least, is that he is nervous about saying that the logos is God, right? So he wants to say that the logos both is and isn't God. So we're not in any kind of fully Trinitarian space yet, where there's a full-throated affirmation that Jesus is somehow fully God. There's just an affirmation that Jesus is sort of like a part of God, maybe. Not necessarily a creature, but not necessarily the divine in flesh. All right. What is it then? I'm going to take a couple questions here in just a moment. What is it exactly then that the logos comes to do? What's the work? And there really are kind of two things that will sound familiar from what we've already kind of said. The first is that the logos comes to reveal, right, or to mediate God's purposes to the world, right? So Jesus, for Justin Martyr, very, very important. Jesus is the great teacher. He teaches to us the truths about the world, about God, about the afterlife, etc. These are the ways. I'm just saying that these are the ways that Justin talks about these things. And there really are three. There are three kind of broad categories actually that show up in his work. Jesus is the one who comes to show us who the true God is. Jesus comes to show us what the good life looks like, the ethical life. And then Jesus comes to show us that there is, in fact, a life after this life. And these are all also topics that were of interest in one way or another also to the philosophers. And so this is why this becomes something that can be articulated to and intelligible for people who maybe don't have a Jewish background, but they have a Greek background. The second thing that the Logos comes to do, so he comes to reveal, and then he also comes to effectively continue that work of making cosmos out of chaos, is a way that we could describe it. And that is mediating God's power to reclaim the world. That's, I think, a kind of the kind of a more biblical maybe way of saying it, or something that's sort of shaped more by the biblical story. Right. So the Logos is a power at work in the world, who comes into the world not just to teach us, but also to, in a sense, begin to heal the world, right? And here the language of sin and the fall and all that kind of stuff comes in, and Jesus then becomes the one who addresses the chaos that we have unleashed, or that the powers and principalities have unleashed, etc. So these are sort of the two ways that the Logos functions. I'm going to talk in just a minute about why, or what was kind of behind the engine behind creating this articulation. But let me stop and see what kinds of comments or questions that you might have. Sarah, do you see anybody? Well, looks like Tom's got a hand up.
Yeah. Just that you've got Daniel's the Son of Man, who stands behind the throne or next to the throne.
Right.
And so that kind of connects up nicely with the wisdom of God and the Word of God being eternal, and back with the continuity of and yet it's a secondary power, not God itself.
Exactly, that's right. That would be from the Jewish side in particular, and I think it also connects up with, and I haven't seen. There's a book that I have like on my wish list. I think it's like $90, so I'm not going to buy it. But I think it actually engages. It brings Justin into discussion with this Jewish tradition that I've talked about before, the two powers in heaven tradition, which comes out of the book of Daniel, or Daniel becomes sort of the main fountain of that. So I think that's right. I think there's something there we haven't explored as much thus far. So thanks for that comment.
The other element, though, is also the word ekkad for composite unity. You know, you've got Adam and Eve, and they shall be one flesh. That word there is ekkad, which is the same one as used in the Shema of Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. So that there's room even in that for the saying that God and the power behind beside the throne,
right,
could be in unity, and yet not the same.
Right. Yeah. Diverse. That's right. Thanks for that, Tom. I appreciate those comments. I'm going to explore some of this, by the way, in a class in the fall, I think. So I'm looking forward to that. Other questions or comments? Things that I can clarify for folks. So if we think about, if we want to pull this down a little bit more obviously this is historical. We're learning history here, and we're trying to think about, what is the early Christian movement like? What is it about? What are the questions it's wrestling with? One of the things I think we could take away from this, even if we don't know what to do, heads or tails, with some of the philosophical concepts or whatever, or theological concepts, is simply the idea or the need to find a way to be able to talk about who Jesus is to us in a way that makes sense to people who don't maybe share that language, right? That being able to share, right, to give an answer for the hope that's within you, that's part of what we see happening here. And it's obviously happening on a level of great sophistication, but it's something that all of us, in a sense, I think, struggle with, or a challenge, maybe we want to say, that we're presented with. And so if we think about this, and so I just want to give you sort of a toehold if this is becoming a little bit too abstract to think about it in that way. So let me talk about what exactly is the function of Logos Christology. Like, this argument is being made. What does it allow someone like Justin Martyr to do? So you give an answer about Jesus, and that answer has several functions, right? Obviously, one function is to try to answer the question, but there are others that are also involved. The first one is what we might call a hermeneutical or interpretive answer, right? So for Justin, he emphasizes especially the logos element, that we might say that one of the reasons to do this is to say that Jesus is not just someone who lived in history, 100 and something years prior. This is when Justin is arguing this, but he's actually the figure that stands behind history, right? He's the one who stands behind the history of Israel. He's the one who stands behind the history of the philosophers, right? And so it's a way of saying that if you want to understand, if you want the key that unlocks the mysteries of the world that all cultures or religions or whatnot have been wrestling with, but in particular the history of Israel, and here the Greco-Roman, then that key can be found only in Jesus, right? And what this allows him then to do, and others who take up this approach to do, is to begin to read the Jewish scriptures, right? The Tanakh, which includes, right, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, to read them in a way that we might say Christologically, right? We read them and we look for the shadow presence of Jesus. So, for instance, we might read the life of David, and we might find things in the life of David that seem to sort of look a little bit like Jesus. Or, of course, we're going to read the book of Isaiah, right? And we hear about the suffering servant, right? And that these texts can be read differently, but Justin's making an argument that they should be read in reference to Jesus. Or we hear about the word that's at the beginning of creation, right? Bringing all things into existence. Or we hear about God's wisdom in the book of Proverbs. All these things then should be connected to or understood as, in some way or another, giving us a lens on who Jesus is, how central he is to what God is doing in the world. The same thing then can also be used to read certain Greco-Roman texts. And I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that some of Plato's key texts, particularly the Timaeus, was undergoing a revival of interest. And the Timaeus really gives to us Plato's theory of the creation of the world. And so, this allows then Justin to say, even the way that Plato is talking about the coming into being of the world, even though it's not as illuminating as, say, perhaps scripture, and certainly not Jesus, it still might give us some truth. And we can know that truth if we apply this Christological lens to our reading. So hermeneutical is one. The second one is the one that I mentioned a few moments ago, which is sort of the missional approach, right? That this is a way of answering or talking about Jesus that would be intelligible to people, particularly, of course, the educated, but it would make sense to them. It would kind of ping off concepts and ideas and texts that they might be familiar with, whereas they may not be familiar with the Torah or certain Jewish traditions, etc. So you can talk then to your audience in a way that makes sense to them. And of course, the last is kind of links up with our fulfillment theology. And this is what we might call the polemical element. And that is simply, right, I mean, Christians are a very small slice of the population, 4 to 7% at the most. This is one of the reasons why Justin comes to be called an apologist, because apologist in that means a defender, right? So he's trying to argue for not only why should the Christian movement exist, but also why it is better than all the other alternatives. And so that's sort of the part of this. So this is the polemical piece, right? The prophets and the philosophers, they both speak about the Logos, but they only do so in a way that's dark and not clear. If you really want to know about the Logos, you come to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is the Logos in flesh. Jesus is the Logos in history. Now, obviously, you would encounter, if you trace some of this out, particularly the New Israel stuff, you have very significant problems that come into play down the road through Christian anti-Semitism. All right, so last thing I want to note before we kind of transition to a slightly different topic is this passage here from Justin Martyr. I'm going to need to adjust my screen just a tad because I can't see all of the quote, and I don't seem to have it here on my page. But it says, our religion is clearly more sublime than any teaching of man for this reason, that the Christ who has appeared for us men represents the Logos principle in its totality. That is both body and Logos and soul. For all that the philosophers and legislatures at any time declared or discovered aright, they accomplished by investigation and perception in accordance with that portion of the Logos which fell to their lot. Right? So everybody is involved. His argument is everybody's involved in trying to understand the thing that holds the world together, right? But each of them has different methods by which they're trying to do this. And he grants that this is a good faith effort, right? And that whatever they really discovered about the world that was true was done so because of the Logos. But then he pivots. But because they did not know the whole of the Logos, who is Christ, they often contradicted each other. And so this gives you a sense where he's basically saying, if you want to be able to exit the contradictions of the philosophers and to fully understand what it is that they themselves could not fully grasp, then come to Jesus, right? I mean, this is an altar call, basically, right? Effectively, that's what he's offering, right? Come to Jesus. He's gonna unlock the secrets of the universe. All right. Let's see if I can. Okay, there we go. All right, so let me move us forward. Unless there are any questions, I can pause here for a second and see if there are any questions. All right. So we don't seem to have any questions. Let me talk then a little bit about the Spirit. So just like I said, Christology is the word for Jesus talk. Pneumatology is the word for Spirit talk. Okay, so reflecting on who the Spirit is. So the first thing we want to say is that that the real obsession in the God talk area is making sense of Jesus, right? Who exactly is Jesus and what's Jesus's relationship to God? But there's also a kind of underground current of wrestling with, well, what is this Spirit about which Jesus spoke, which Jesus gives, which I have experienced in the context of worship? How do we talk about the Spirit? What are we going to do? And so you should know that it takes a very long time, honestly, for us to get a really robust conversation going about the Spirit. I would say up into the 19th and 20th century really is when that finally kind of takes off, really through traditions that become the Pentecostal movement. But already early on, very, very early on, obviously in the New Testament, but also in writers like Justin, we also have places where we have iterations about the presence and importance of the Spirit. So here's a quote I've given to you just as an example to show you that it shows up. So Justin here says, we are called atheists, and we confess that we are atheists so far as gods of this sort are concerned, but not with respect to the most true God, who is free from all impurity. But both him and the Son and the prophetic Spirit we worship and adore, declaring to everyone who wishes to learn as we have been taught. So I simply put that forward to you just so you see that very early on, we already have a Father, Son, Spirit kind of triadic sensibility there, where people are trying to wrestle with who exactly is the Spirit. Now, there are three ways that we can see Spirit language happening in and among early Christians. The first is under the broad category of what we might call revelation. We might include here other things like illumination or inspiration, but revelation simply means disclosure of knowledge, right? You come, in a sense, to know who Jesus is by receiving the Spirit, right? It opens your eyes, it opens your ears, it opens your heart, right? That's kind of the idea. So the Spirit is the one who is especially associated with taking the life and significance of Jesus, which is still outside. He might have become human, but he didn't become me, and he didn't become you. He became his own person. And so there's still this, space between. So who is it that's going to fill that space? It's going to be the Spirit. So God is the one who has to complete that circle, and that happens through the power of the Spirit. The way that the early Christians talk about this, in particular, primarily, is under either discussion of contemporary prophets who are speaking by the power of the Spirit, or through the production of other texts, right? So the production in particular of New Testament texts. And here, of course, is an example that we see, and this is comes out of an epistle called First Clement, which is actually from the first century, probably in the 80s or 90s. So as it says there, look closely at the scriptures, which are the true utterances of the Holy Ghost. So there's a kind of sensibility, right, that somehow the Spirit is the one that was involved in enabling the production of these texts, which themselves seem to convey the power of the Spirit into our lives. So revelation, disclosure of knowledge, right? That's number one. Number two is that the Spirit is also talked about as this gift that God gives to us that empowers us to do certain kinds of things, right? So it's the gift that's given, right, in the wake of Jesus's resurrection. And in fact, Paul himself talks about the Spirit as the Spirit of resurrection. And what it enables you to do, what we find when we look at the text that we have, is that it's the power of God in us, enabling us to withstand persecution, right? It's the power of God in us, enabling us to face the daily trials or temptations that we might have. And of course, it is also going to be the power that is sort of usually attributed to as enabling miraculous kinds of events to take place. So if there's any sort of discussion of a miracle in a text, they're almost always going to say that this is the power of the Spirit at work in the midst of the community. The last thing then is a kind of a broad category that I call incorporation. And what I mean by that is that the Spirit becomes a means by which we talk about how we become connected in a more intimate and deeper way with God. And I think we see this also in the early texts that we look at, and in particular, especially in the process of prayer. Prayer is a place where we hear about the power of the Spirit unlocking the heart, unlocking the mind, and drawing us into connection to God in a way that is superior almost, perhaps, to other modes by which we can connect to God. And I'm talking here about, the sacraments and even hearing scripture. It's in prayer that a sort of intimate relationship is formed, and it's by the power of the Spirit that prayer life is initiated, energized, and built up. So these three areas become the way. Now, all of these, by the way, almost none of them talk about who exactly is the Spirit and how does the Spirit relate to God. It just talks about what the Spirit does. And that tends to be the language that we have for most of the early church. I have this question here: why is there reticence in reflecting on the Spirit? I'm not going to belabor this question, but I just want to say that I tend to think it's because of the radical, sort of revolutionary nature of the power of the Spirit, right? This is the revolutionary principle that can't be controlled, right? Jesus himself says it blows wherever it wills. And you know, it comes in the image of a rushing wind and tongues of fire, right? That if you're someone who, you know, if you're like a church official or something where you're kind of worried that people are getting a little crazy, that's going to make you nervous. And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't see as much discussion of it, even by the time we get up to the Nicene Creed. And I'll share some of that stuff with you down the road as we in the fall, hopefully, if you're able to come back for a class. So let me stop there for 1 second. And see what kind of questions you have. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, as we think about you know, things like the Nicene Creed and such, you know, of trying to understand God and rationalize him and put him in a box almost, as opposed to an understanding from the Spirit side. You know, sometimes there's you might divide it the Spirit versus rational, even rational
Right.
thought.
Yeah, that's actually gonna become a debate that we talk about, I think, in a couple weeks. So I appreciate that. Jeff, did you have a comment?
Say, you know, this strikes me as being kind of revolutionary compared to what I understand about, you know, traditional Judaism. So did this, I mean, was this kind of very controversial, very new, very dramatic, this talk of the Spirit and the power of the Spirit?
It's not new. It very in the sense that it doesn't come out of nowhere. We obviously, if you you know, when we're reading through the Old Testament, we hear all kinds of places where we hear about the Spirit coming on people and them having prophetic utterance, and certain kinds of events that are connected to God's Spirit. So there's already within the Jewish tradition a sense of God's Spirit, God's ruach or breath, being something that's close by, and to some extent even given to us. What I do think is distinct about some of this is a sense of the palpable, ongoing presence. And I think one of the things that maybe in the Old Testament, and it would be interesting if I to read some rabbinic texts from this period, but I think there was a sense in which the Spirit comes and the Spirit goes. And I think the early Christians are convinced that the Spirit comes and the Spirit stays. And that might be where we found the difference, if you will. But there's definitely already language around the Spirit. So, yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kristen, there was one other thought I was having, especially for today and how we're, and that is what Justin was saying about the truth. And that presenting Jesus as the truth. And, you know, so often in our world, we're being confronted with, well, that's your truth. And where truth has become relative.
Yeah, I mean, I think I hear you. I also think though that like he lived in a world where there were many truths as well. Um, and so I would agree. We want to, I think, affirm the truth of who Jesus is, right? That in the coming of Jesus, the world itself is kind of inflected on a hinge, right? It's turned. That his resurrection is what means everything to everywhere. The thing that worries me when we use that language is the history of the church in using that kind of discourse over the last many years, where it became a stick by which we beat people over the head. So we have to find, what I think is that we have to find a way to affirm and to inhabit that sense of truth, open to the reality that we don't possess it, right? Because if we're saying Jesus is the truth, we don't possess Jesus, but we are trying our best to live in the light of who Jesus is. And I think that might be a way for us to do that. And I think that would actually even to some extent cohere with Justin to a certain extent as well. All right, I want to do one last thing. We're at 12:01. I do want to pivot slightly to a kind of a new direction that we're going to be heading once we come back, and that has to do with the debates in the early life of the church. So this is called, as you can see, Christian Pluralism and the Struggle for Catholicity. Very academic title. I'm sorry. Christian pluralism refers to the diversity that I have been speaking about, right? That there's a sense of diversity. There are different ways of being Christian. Everyone, in a sense, is saying they're devoted to Jesus, but that devotion winds up being expressed in some ways differently. And so there is a certain sense in which even the categories around martyrdom and asceticism are still open to interpretation. What kind of asceticism? What kind of faithful witness? What do those things look like? So that's the kind of sensibility that I want to encourage for us to be thinking about. And part of the reason for that is not only because it's historically true, but also because for us, we live in a world where there are many churches, right? There are many ways of being Christian. And so how do we navigate that reality, and can we take courage and also lessons potentially perhaps from the early church as they wrestle through this problem? So as I mentioned here, the history of the early Christian movement, it's marked by constant negotiation and renegotiation of identity. We could also say it's marked by constant infighting and disputation. So this is my way of giving it as nice of a gloss as I can. I mean, people are basically fighting, and you probably have heard this before, that you fight, it's like you fight family members the hardest, right? So these are people who are together in a sense, and in their togetherness, they hold something that's central to them, and therefore they're going to fight the hardest over it, that kind of thing. So the reason is that this is a period in which the boundaries of what exactly is this Christian movement going to be are not totally fixed, right? Things are very fluid. Jesus has come. We're just starting to produce new texts. We're just starting to have communities arise. We don't even have a set authoritative canon, right? A Bible, in a sense, right? So how are we going to negotiate? How are we going to interpret? Like, not only how are we going to interpret these texts, but which text should we really interpret? Which ones should be the ones that are authoritative for us? Those are all open questions. And so you can imagine then different communities are going to be attracted to different kinds of questions and different types of texts, and that's going to produce some of the differences. So one of the things I wanted to highlight for you is, and I think this is going to be useful, I hope, as we move through, is just to expose you to this, to these two categories, the normative versus the descriptive. And these are what we might call categories of definition. And they're oftentimes used in historical, philosophical types of conversations. So I'm just introducing them because I hope that that this will be helpful to you as we move through together. I won't really come back to them unless need be later on. So what is the normative? The normative is a normative definition is when we define something and we say that's the true thing. So this might be where we would say that something is true Christianity versus false Christianity. All right. So that's a normative. And normative really carries with it the idea of norming, right? A norm, a standard. So this is what the thing is. A descriptive definition, then, in contrast to a normative, is the idea of saying that anything that identifies itself as Christian, we need to understand it as Christian, right? So a descriptive then is going to be to say, okay, we're going to read certain texts that look like they're Christian, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas or whatever the case may be, because clearly this deals with Christian themes. Jesus is a key player. It was probably being used by some Christian communities. Without deciding, is it true Christianity or not, right? So the normative and the descriptive are two kind of categories by which we can engage things. So when I use language about Christian during this period, the descriptive gives us a big tent, and the normative is something that would be a little bit smaller than that. And one of the challenges then that we want to keep in mind as we move through the 2nd century and we think about this struggle that's going on in the life of the early Christian movement is that it's precisely not decided yet what the normative is going to be, right? No, we are looking back, right? We are looking back with a kind of sense about what is true Christianity, which probably also is open to interpretation. But back then, they didn't even have that to look back on, right? So the normative hasn't really even been worked out yet, and we want to make sure that we keep that in mind. And then if we do that, this does give us a much bigger frame by which to say, okay, there's a lot of different ways in this early period of being Christian. So how then did they negotiate this? How did some groups wind up leaving and becoming something else while other groups stayed, right? So that's kind of the process. So Christian pluralism and the struggle then for Catholicity, the word Catholic here is simply the word for universal. And Catholicity means how can we have as big a tent as possible, but it's still going to be a tent, which means there still are going to be some kind of borders. And so that's the way I'm going to approach our discussion when we come back together. We're going to wind up talking a little bit about Gnosticism or the early Gnostics, as well as the Montanist movement. And these are sort of struggles that are going on within the church, within different Christian communities, to try to understand what's legit and what's going to be not legit for some people. So I'm going to come back to that later on down the road. It's 12:07. Let me stop there and just see what kinds of comments or questions you might have. Looks like most people actually stayed. I'm surprised. I thought I might lose you. Once I showed you that thing, Christian pluralism and the struggle for Catholicity, I figured some of you would just be like, I'm out. All right, let me stop there. And Sarah, do you see anyone? Looks like Tom has another question or comment from Tom.
I was just wondering, have you ever seen this book? Let's see if we can see that. But when Jesus became God, Rubinstein. Yeah. But I read that a few years back. He's a good storyteller of this time period. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Tom.
I would just say that the distinction between normative and descriptive is very helpful as we think of events back then and as things evolved, and the point that normative was still a work in progress. And I think we have that today. We can describe various Christian practices, and describing them doesn't necessarily take a position on what's normative, what should be.
Right. That's right. And I hope this will be helpful. And I'm going to talk, we're going to utilize kind of the language. So basically one of the ways that this gets worked out is through the rhetoric of heresy versus orthodoxy. And one of the things we want to keep in mind if we're looking at it historically